When did you realize that you got to write a book on the way you think, the way you speak, the way you interact, the way you talk to yourself or others?
Communication can influence people's perceptions. So some people are born with skills and gifts that help them get a little closer sooner, but that doesn't mean we don't have to work at it. I believe there are only 3 ways to get better at communication, and they're the same ways to get better at any skill: repetition, reflection, and feedback. Many of us, when we communicate, we want to do it right. There is no right way to communicate. There are better ways and ways, but there is no one right way. Communication is about connection. Communication is all about connection, coordination, collaboration. Communication is operationalized leadership. Communication is how we relate. Most people get nervous speaking in spontaneous situations, in any situation. Anxiety looms large in communication. We have some research that says 85% of people experience anxiety in their communication. We're more nervous in front of the people we know than the people we don't know.
I would like to become a better listener. What would be your one piece of advice to him or her?
So I'm gonna cheat. We just listen to the top line. If somebody wants to be a better listener, the number one thing I would say: listen for the bottom line.
Hey, Matt, such a pleasure having you here. Thank you for accepting our invitation and be our guest on our show, the xMonks Drive.
Super excited to be here with you. Looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah. So how's the day been? I understand that you've got 2 teenager boys. How is life with them? Tell me about that.
I love my boys. We get along super well, but as with many teens, they have lots going on, everything from school to social life to activities outside of school. It's almost a 4-dimensional calendaring problem that we have.
I'm sure. And there are some problems in life which are good to have.
There are, and I wouldn't trade it for the world.
Absolutely, absolutely. And Matt, thank you so much for writing such an incredible book on Think Faster and Talk Smarter. Moreover, because communication, the way you interact with others, the way you interact with yourself, the way you interact with your teenager boys, right, has got to do a lot with who you are as an individual. And the more and more I work with leaders at the C-suite level in the corporates, the more I realize the importance of speaking eloquently that lands well. When did you realize that you got to write a book on the way you think, the way you speak, the way you interact, the way you talk to yourself or others?
So I've always been passionate about communication, and for the past 20 plus years, I've been teaching communication skills and consulting for companies around the world. So this is something that's always been on my mind, but more and more I've come to realize how important in the moment communication is. I'd seen it for a long time in the classes I teach, but it really came to the forefront when the deans at Stanford's Graduate School of Business, where I teach, came and asked me. This was about 9 years ago. They came to me and said, "We have a problem. Our amazingly bright students are struggling to answer questions in the moment when the professor says, 'What do you think?' and they have to respond right away." And so they asked me to come up with some kind of content to help our students. And that's exactly what I did. I jumped in and looked at research in psychology, anthropology, sociology, neuroscience, even acting and improvisation. And from that, created a methodology that I now teach to all Stanford MBAs, have the chance within the first 3 weeks of being on campus to take the course. And we found that the students feel more comfortable and confident speaking up, and the professors feel better about their answers. But shortly after creating the content, I began using it in my coaching practice and teaching I do outside of Stanford. And it became very clear to me that this is something that's really important to people. And it was confirmed. I host a podcast myself called Think Fast, Talk Smart. And many people who listened in asked for content just like this. So I had a lot of things triangulating that came together to say that this was something that needed to be communicated broadly.
Absolutely, Matt. Yeah, thank you so much for sharing that. You know what? For the longest period of time, I struggle the way I interact with myself. I have struggled myself the way I interact with others. And you use this word so beautifully, in the moment conversations. I have
Yes.
struggled that. So I know what you are talking about. Matt, I'm a firm believer who you become as an adult, what you do for your living has to do with who you were as a child. I
Hmm.
personally believe that in our childhood, a seed is planted that continues to blossom in our adulthood. Where do you find a connect between what happened in your childhood and what you do today? Where's the connection?
Well, so there are lots of connection points for me. If you'll allow me, I'm going to tell 3 quick stories, and I'll tell them right back to back, if that's all
Absolutely.
right by you.
Absolutely.
So
Yeah.
when I was about 7 years old, my father was reading the newspaper. This is back in the day where people had newspaper that was actual
Yeah.
paper. He was laughing, and I came up and I said, "Dad, what's so funny?" And he showed me a comic strip he was reading. And the comic strip was a picture of a father with his arm around his young son, looking at the store that the father clearly owned. And across the store was a sign that said, "Going out of business sale." And the caption was, "Someday, son, this will all be yours." And I didn't understand it. I didn't understand, how is this possible? The store's going out of business. My father said, "No, no, no, no. That's a ploy, a trick that they use to get people to come in because they think they'll get good deals." And I started thinking, communication can influence people's perceptions. Not
Hmm.
more than a year later, my mother insisted that we have a garage sale. That's where you put all of your stuff out in your yard, and people in the neighborhood come by and buy it. And where I grew up, everybody had garage sales all the time. It was nothing new. But my mother insisted that my brother and I spell the signs that announced our garage sale wrong. And we inserted the letter B in garage, which makes garbage. So while everybody else was having a garage sale, we were having a garbage sale. And fascinatingly, we sold more stuff that weekend than anybody else in the neighborhood. And to this day, my mother thinks it's because we misspelled it and people noticed it. I think people thought we were stupid. Doesn't matter. Again, I learned that through the way we communicate, the language and words we use can influence people.
Hmm.
And then finally, several years later, when I was in high school, I was asked to speak at a speech tournament. My teacher essentially assigned me to do it. And I was giving a speech on something I was passionate about then, still passionate about now, which is the martial arts. And I was giving a speech on karate. And I was so nervous because the parents of my friends were the judges. My friends were in the room. The girl I liked was in the room. I started my speech with a karate kick, but I was so nervous I forgot to put on my special karate pants that have a little extra room in them. I
Yeah.
ripped my pants from zipper to belt buckle.
Hmm.
And what that taught me in that moment is just how the impact of anxiety can influence our communication. So those
Yeah.
3 stories in my early childhood absolutely influenced what I do today. So I agree with you that it's a big deal, and many of us focus on that.
Yeah. This is so interesting for me. In all the 3 examples that you spoke about while you were 7 years, the example of the garage and the garbage sale, and
Yes.
the karate kick that you spoke about. Interestingly, you spoke about influence and you did not speak about your language, the way you interact with others can manipulate others as well. You chose to stick to influence. So that tells me something. Help me understand, you can use your conversation, you can use the way you talk to influence people. At the same time, you can use the same thing to manipulate people as well. What, according to you, is the key difference that you've come across people who leverage this gift of communication to influence people vis-a-vis people who use and leverage that to create nuclear bombs and manipulate others?
Well, so that's a tricky question, right? Those of us who study these techniques like to say that the techniques are neutral. It's the intent behind the users of the
Yeah.
techniques that makes the difference. So, in the classes I teach and those of my peers that teach, we talk a lot about ethics, and we talk
Hmm.
about a lot of the importance. And I, for one, believe it's critical that we alert people and teach people about these skills so that they
Hmm.
can be aware when they're being used against them. So one
Hmm.
way to defend against some of the challenges you're talking about in terms of manipulation, coercion, etc., is to become aware of what those techniques are. And that's why I always teach ethics. I always teach responsibility when it comes to using these techniques. But if we don't know them, we can become victimized by them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Matt, today there is, as I'm speaking this, I'm biting my tongue as well because it may backfire for me. And yet, let me just take a chance. Everyone, given a choice to everyone, they would love to speak on the TEDx platform and claim themselves to be a TED speaker. What's about TED platform that you have noticed that draws so much attention from people? Is it worth it?
Okay, so those are two very different questions.
Yeah, so a lot of questions I have around that, right? So I'm just passing on the ball to you.
Yeah.
Let's hear your views on that.
So I think opportunities like TED, and there are many others around, are opportunities for people to have a platform of people who are like-minded, intelligent, engaged people. So I think it's exciting to have that opportunity to share your thoughts. There's an exclusivity to it, and humans like to be in places where it's slightly harder to get into. So I think there's some of that. TED is a very important place for people to share ideas. I appreciate TED. I coach people at how to speak at TED. I've spoken. I've done a few TEDx talks myself. And it's a wonderful opportunity. Now, the question is it worth it? So I'm going to answer that in two different ways. If you have something important to say, and to set your goal as the only way to get that message out is to be on a TED or TEDx stage, I think that's problematic. I think it's problematic because there are lots of other important ways that we can get our messages out. Now, is aiming to be a communicator who can communicate confidently, competently, in a compelling manner, like somebody who does a TED speech? I think that's a good goal for everybody to have. I think everybody should work to develop their skills. So if by having that as a goal, and it doesn't restrict you to striving for other ways to get your message out, then I don't think it's a bad thing, as long as we don't get disappointed if we don't make it. If we understand that it's in the journey and learning the skills where the value is, then I think having that as a goal is a lovely thing.
Thank you. Thank you. Matt, as I mentioned, right, the more and more I'm interacting, I'm working with C-suite leaders, the more I'm realizing the importance of being a powerful communicator. What, according to you, defines and determines that this person is a powerful speaker? What would you consider, apart from, of course, the command over language, the voice modulation, one's ability to interact, one's ability to play with silence, take pauses, and all those things which are so cliched? I'm sure there's a lens through which you look at individual and say, this person is a powerful communicator. Tell us those things that only you can notice and not visible to the eyes of the general public.
Well, so I don't think there's anything, so I'm going to challenge you on this. I don't think there's anything that I see that others don't see. I think I'm a little more sensitive to the way people combine things, but we feel this. There's no magic. I don't have a pair of glasses that sees something different than others. What I will say is, what I think makes for a really powerful communicator is somebody who listens. I think listening is critical. Targeting messages that are relevant and specific and salient to the audience, and doing so in a captivating way, making it engaging and interesting. I believe attention is the most precious commodity we have in the world today. And a good, competent, powerful speaker manages people's attention through engagement, makes the content clear, concise, and relevant, and really listens to what's needed in the moment. That's what I think makes for charisma and power in a communicator. And that's why it doesn't have to be flawless. You can make mistakes. You can say and ah. You can look away and look down. As long as you have those essential ingredients, you can be a really powerful communicator.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing that, because, very often I come across people that you need to be a perfect speaker without ums and the oohs, without any filler words, and you need to use those powerful vocabulary, right? what I'm listening right now, for as long as you are being human authentic and are able to build that genuine connections, and you use the word clear, concise, and relevant, for as long as
Yes.
you can approach that conversation from being human perspective,
Mm-hmm.
you have done your job. Now, when here's a question. Had it been so simple that we would have more effective, articulate communicators in the world, which is not the case, right? Which is not the case. 8 out of 10 leaders that you meet in the corporate world, they would tell you, we would like to become better in communication. They will tell you that they would like to become better in public speaking. They would like to become better in influencing others. And communication plays a very vital role in the way you build your influence.
Absolutely.
If it's that simple, how come it does not come to people so easily?
Yeah, so we vary, right? And we vary in experience, we vary in our temperament and our desires. We have this notion that because we've been speaking, essentially, at least verbally speaking, shortly after we're born, within the first year or so, we're communicating with sounds. We feel like it should be natural to us, but I disagree with that. I mean, any skill that requires a level of expertise and effort requires time to develop it, hone it. If you want to be a guitar player, you got to practice. If you want to play
Of
cricket or
course.
football, you have to practice. And yet we think that communication, just because everybody can do it, means that we should be great at it. So, this is not shocking to somebody who has spent his career teaching people and coaching people on communication, that I believe it's something we have to commit and dedicate to. I believe there are only 3 ways to get better at communication, and they're the same ways to get better at any skill: repetition, reflection, and feedback. You need to do those 3 things. You got to practice. You got to reflect. Otherwise, you fall victim to that saying about insanity, doing the same thing over and over again, expecting different results. So we have to reflect and think about what works, what doesn't. And then finally, we need to get feedback from trusted others. Maybe they're teachers, maybe they're authors, coaches, podcast hosts, peers, trusted others. That's how we get better. So this idea that, hey, everybody should just be good at it, I think is not the way we look at other things. I mean, you wouldn't look at some athlete and say, well, you just should be good at it. No, of course you have to work at it. So
Yeah.
some people are born with skills and gifts that help them get a little closer sooner, but that doesn't mean we don't have to work at it.
Yeah. These 3 words that you've shared: repetition, reflection, and feedback.
Yes.
Probably in the last 10 days' time, more or less in the same order, I've heard that from 4 different people. I was talking to a friend of mine who happens to be a guitarist. He plays amazingly well. He mentioned exactly the same thing. His name is Amar. Amar has been a college mate. So I was, out of curiosity, I asked him, I said, how come you could be so good? And it's been years that I've been listening to you. How could you be so good? And he said, repetition, reflection, and feedback. Right.
Yeah.
I was talking to a friend of mine who happens to be a stand-up comedian.
Oh.
And I was very curious. I said, what is it that differentiates you from the rest of the world? What is it that you bring in which is not easily accessible to other people? He said, Gaurav, to tell you the truth, nothing much. I make sure that I reflect on everything that's happening around me. So the way people connect with what's happening around them is very different from the way I reflect and look at what's happening around me. So he started with the reflection, and then he said, I repeat and look at every time when I'm making a joke, for how long people are laughing, how long people are giggling. Is it 10 seconds? Is it 20 seconds? And if I'm delivering a stand-up comedy talk for 10 minutes, I need to have those kind of arcs, right? Where the laughter begins and it dies. It begins, it dies. It begins, it dies. And the third thing is I am so open to the feedback. That's the second one. The third one that I was talking to, now this person he is into skating.
Okay.
Right?
Yeah.
The same thing. I continue to repeat what I really know, what I do well. I reflect on what is it that I'm going through in my body while I am skating. And the only, I think, he's been able to reflect into the responses of his body as well, right? The way his body is responding to the turns while he's making those turns. So, Matt,
Yeah, that's really cool.
isn't it? Isn't it a
Yeah.
repetition, reflection, and feedback? Wow.
And I love it. So there must be something in the universe that's bringing all that
There
to
is,
you.
oh, absolutely, because I am a very in-time person. I don't prepare well. I know that. For me, my way of preparing is doing things 10 times. So I would not slot dedicated time to prepare a talk. I'll rather fail 10 times and then show up a little better on the 11th time and a little better on the 12th time. And for me, this subject is anyways important, Matt, because communication is something that I struggled for the longest period of time. And in the initial phase of my life, I could not even speak properly. I used to stutter. And I remember the comments people would have for me, and I would have tears rolling down my cheek because it had a direct impact on my self-esteem, the way I looked at myself, the way I spoke about myself, the kind of connection that I build for myself, with others, with life. That brings to me a question. One of the 6 steps that you have spoken about to get better at spontaneous speaking in your book, Think Faster and Talk Smarter. One of the points you have spoken about is unlocking. That's point number 2. I'll come to point number 1 as well when you spoke about being calm. Let's begin with the second point, unlocking, where you have spoken about the way you judge yourself, the kind of connection that you have with yourself. Help me understand, when you speak about talking smarter, what has talking smarter to do with the way you look at yourself? And if you can share a couple of stories with us to make it more vivid and more alive.
Certainly. Before I answer this question, I want to go back to the story you told about yourself. So first, thank you for sharing that. It's hard to grow up with a speech impediment, and it's hard to talk about it. So I appreciate you sharing that with me and with everybody listening. And one of the things that I like that you said, that you would rather go 10 times, so on the 11th time it was better. I love that approach, because what it says is that each time you are learning, you're not seeing it as a failure, you're seeing it as a way to learn and to grow. And that says a lot about you as a person, but also it says a lot about how you go about connecting with people and communicating effectively. And so I encourage people not to see a communication that doesn't go the way they wanted it to as a failure. It's just one way of doing it. In the book, I talk about reframing mistakes as missed takes. In filming, they'll do a take 1, take 2 with that little clapboard. That's exactly what you were doing. You're saying it takes you 10 takes before you can get to the one that you really like. That's a great attitude. So I just wanted to call that out and appreciate it. Now, your question is, through our communication, do we define ourselves, and how do we see ourselves and have others come to see us?
Or vice versa.
Or vice versa.
Yeah.
How others see us defines who we are, is what you're saying. Yeah, it works both ways. Here's the thing. Communication is about connection. The word communication, the origin of the word communication means to make common. So if you think about it, communication is all about connection, coordination, collaboration. And that's not just in the meaning that you're making, it's the way in which you're seeing yourself and the audience you're speaking to. So if I take a harsh tone, or a tone that's a little demeaning or a little more expert, I'm telling you not just my information, but how I see you and how I see myself in relationship to you. So it is through communication, not only that we make meaning of the information, but it's also how we make meaning of ourselves and the others we're communicating with in the world. So communication is, when I talk about leadership, I say communication is operationalized leadership. Communication is how we relate. There are some people who argue that in order for humans to be empathetic, they needed to develop a way to do that. And that's where language came from, that the ability to care for yourself and others necessitated the creation of language and communication. Not everybody agrees with that, but I'm simply saying that it helps identify who we are and how we are in the world.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that. You know, in the last 4 conversations that I've had with different guests, I had a conversation with a gentleman called Jerry Colonna. Jerry Colonna is a very dear friend. He has written a couple of books, including Reboot and the recently published book called Reunion.
Okay.
He emphasized on the importance of connection, right? Why am I bringing it? Because you just use the word connection and collaboration while we are talking about conversations. The second person that I interviewed, her name is Judy Robinett. Judy Robinett is known as the queen of connections, right?
Mm-hmm.
She has written a book on how can you be a powerful connector. Last night I was interviewing another gentleman. His name is Ed Morrison. He has written a book called Strategic Doing. And I asked this question from Ed. Ed, help me understand, what is the difference between strategic thinking and strategic doing? And one of the key points that he emphasized on is the importance of deep conversations. And I'm not surprised that the universe is telling me something, and we are talking about conversations.
That's right. That's right. No, I think you have a lot of things that line up in your life, but I think that's fascinating. I mean, what I hear you saying in those 2 authors is that this notion of connection is really important. And the way we do it, again, is through communication.
Yeah. I think probably universe is telling me to revisit the way I communicate with my own self and the kind of conversations that I'm having with my own self and others, and revisit and further deepen my connections, not only with myself, with the world around as well. So let's take a little deeper dive in this book, Matt. How to speak successfully when you are put on the spot. Think faster, talk smarter. 6 steps to better spontaneous speaking. Now, let's say if we are getting into a quick masterclass for the 15 minutes for our audience, that could possibly help them to become better in their conversations. The first step is calm. The second is unlock. The third is redefine. The fourth is listen.
Yes.
The fifth is structure. And the sixth one is focus. Where would you like to begin?
Well, I mean, we can begin at the beginning, which is really about calm. Most people get nervous speaking in spontaneous situations, in any situation. Anxiety looms large in communication. We have some research that says 85% of people experience anxiety in their communication. Quite frankly, I think the other 15% are lying. So we need to learn to manage that anxiety. And by manage anxiety, I mean, we have to find ways that help us get through it. And there are lots of things we can do. We have to manage both symptoms and sources. Symptoms are the things we physiologically experience. Sources are the things that initiate it. So great ways to manage symptoms when we get very shaky in our hands, or our heart beats faster, or we turn red and perspire. Deep belly breathing, the kind you would do if you've ever done yoga or Tai Chi, where you can fill your lower abdomen. And then you work to make sure that your exhale is twice as long as your inhale. If you do these things, it will help you to calm your autonomic nervous system and feel better. There are other things you can do as well. Then mentally, we can do things to manage some of the sources of anxiety. Many of us feel like we're being judged and evaluated all the time. And if we can remind ourselves that we are in service of our audience, that we have value to bring to the audience that we're speaking to, if we can do that, then it helps us focus externally, not internally, and that can help us be better at what we're doing. So there are lots of things you can do to help calm yourself down and build your confidence.
Yeah. You know, we're just talking about being calm in the moment. You spoke about deep breathing. You spoke about calming your anxiety. I'm just wondering, what do you think, what according to you, when somebody is at a C-suite level, somebody is leading a team, when the person is really comfortable doing 10 different things in a arena which might be very unfamiliar That could be an unfamiliar territory for this person. And yet, when it comes to speaking in front of an audience that the person is familiar with, then also the person loses the calm. What do you think? What, according to you, is at stake for this person that he's trying to avoid, and what image is he trying to, or is she trying to protect, because of which the person trips over, loses the calm?
I think that those of us who study this believe that this is part of being human, that it's innate to who we are. And it really boils down to, we think, to what we call relative status. In a social
Yeah.
group, people have different statuses. And I know I'm not saying who drives the fanciest car or has the most social media posts.
No.
What I'm talking about is where is your relative ranking to others? And those who are higher in rank and status, they get more access to good things like shelter and opportunity and reproduction and food and everything. And those who have lower status have less of that. And if you're really low status, you risk lots of things. So anything we do that puts our status at risk, like standing up and asserting our position in front of others, potentially could have us lose our status. So the point is that I think what underlies all of this, and in the situations you're talking about, it can be worse in front of people you know, because they know you and they know your status, and the consequence of failing, whatever fail means, could be significant or more significant in front of people you know. So when you look at it through that lens, it actually makes sense that we're more nervous in front of the people we know than the people we don't know.
Yeah. And also the way you relate to others. As I was just listening to you, it reminded me, day before yesterday, I spoke at two forums. At one forum, there were people that I would consider as my competition. And while I was in that forum, I could experience, I was choked to some extent. I could not even speak what I wanted to express. And there's another forum where I was in a familiar ground, where I know people are going to respect and appreciate what I'm going to share with them. Now, it's less to do with who was there around me. It's more to do with the way I was connecting with them. If I'm looking at them as competition, I could experience that contraction in my body. Right? And I think that brings to the second point. When you have spoken about unlock in that book, tell me more about that. What do you mean by unlock? How can one do that? Where should one begin?
Yeah, so many of us, when we communicate, we want to do it right. As if there is a right way. There is no right way to communicate. There are better ways and worse ways, but there is no one right way. Yet we strive to be perfect, to do it right. And when we do that, that locks us into fixating on what we're saying, how we're saying it. In other words, we're leveraging a lot of our mental processing power to judge and evaluate everything we're saying, which means we have a reduced amount of processing power to focus on what we're actually saying. So when we transition or unlock ourselves from just focusing on perfection and focus rather on connection, being in the present, other focus, turning that volume down on that evaluation, we actually end up being able to communicate better. So the unlock is to reduce the pressure we put on ourselves to just get the job done rather than trying to do it perfectly. And in so doing, by reducing the striving for perfection, we actually increase the likelihood that we will do what we're doing very well.
Yeah. It reminds me of two words, authenticity and acceptance.
Yeah, absolutely. I call it grace. I call it grace. You have to give yourself a little grace, but same thing. It's the same idea.
Yeah. What am I seeking for in this moment? Am I willing to step into authenticity and speak my truth? And that truth might come from a space of dissonance. It might come from a space of not being totally convinced and not being totally operating from a space of perfection. But for as long as you are willing to march ahead and take the next step possible forward, you'll be able to sail through that. Let's take one step forward here. You spoke about redefining listening, structure, and focus. If you can just take us through that. And interestingly, very rare I've come across people, Matt, and very rare I've come across books where focusing on the audience is the last step. Every time when I speak to people, or every time when I speak to consultants, The communication coaches, they start their journey from knowing your audience really well. Now,
Yes.
in this book, you have flipped the process. Help me understand, why have you chosen to focus on your audience in the last bit, which is the sixth phase? And please take us through the third, fourth, fifth, and sixth phase.
Okay, let me catch you up. So let me answer your first question first. So if the book is divided, and the methodology is divided into two major parts. There's the mindset part, which is the first 4 steps. We've already talked about the first 2. The second 2 steps in the methodology, the last 2 steps, are about messaging. So that's the actual creation of the messages you have. And when you're actually creating messages, knowing your audience is important. So I am actually completely in alignment with what most people say. What I think I'm adding to the equation is all this pre-work we have to do. My book is filled with counterintuitive ideas. One of the biggest counterintuitive ideas is that you actually have to practice and work to be spontaneous, which it sounds contradictory, right? Spontaneity implies you're doing it in the moment,
Wow.
but you actually have to build that up. So the whole mindset piece is really what sets you up to craft messages. And I will always say, you must craft your message with your audience in mind. So step 5 is to use structure. I believe we know from neuroscience that information has to be packaged clearly for our audience to understand it. And by clearly, what I mean is it has to be packaged in a way that has a logical beginning, middle, and end, where the points fit together. If we just list information, that's very difficult for people to take in. We don't do well with itemization of information. It has to be put into a story structure, a framework. Once we've thought about our framework, we then have to think about, how do we tailor the material that goes into that framework to be relevant to our audience? So that's in alignment, I think, with much of what you've heard. I certainly am not a rebel saying only think about your audience at the end. I think you always have to be audience centric.
Yeah.
But before we can get to the message creation and focusing of that message, we have to go through the other 2 steps. So it starts with calm, that is managing anxiety. It moves to unlock, that is turning that evaluative mindset down. It's about connection, not perfection. Step 3 is about seeing these spontaneous speaking situations as opportunities, not threats. Many of us feel that when we're put on the spot, that it is a challenge to us personally, and we get defensive, we get tight, our tone becomes very harsh and curt. If we see it, though, as an opportunity to extend, to expand, to connect, then that changes how we approach it. And then the 4th step is listening. Before you can craft a message, you have to really listen in depth to understand what's needed. Many of us listen just enough to get a little bit of insight into what the person's saying, and then we begin rehearsing, thinking about our counter offers. We get in our own head without connecting to the person. So you calm, you unlock, you reframe, you listen, and then you craft messages using structure, and then finally you focus. So that's the full process. Being audience-centric, being structured, very critical.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you so much for sharing that, Matt. And calm, that unlock, the reframe or the redefine that you spoke about in the listening part. And interestingly, when we started this conversation, you emphasized a lot on listening. And I personally believe that effective listening can elevate a conversation and can allow the person to look at the things that he has not even considered yet for himself. And effectively, the deep level of listening can provide a platform for your speaker that she would be able to revisit within herself that she has not yet revisited.
I like the way you said that. That was very elegant. Thank you.
Yeah. Matt, as much as I would want to simplify listening, hey, listen deeply, I know it lands at the cognitive level and yet does not solve, does not water the opportunity that we have to become better listeners. If somebody comes to you and say, hey, I would like to become better listener, what would be your one piece of advice to him or her?
So I'm gonna cheat. If somebody wants to be a better listener, the number one thing I would say, if I could only say one thing, is listen for the bottom line. Listen for what is the bottom line of what somebody is saying. We just listen to the top line. If we listen to the bottom line, we will connect more and listen more deeply. It's also about not just listening, but reflecting back what you hear. So I can listen intently, but if I don't demonstrate to you through what I do with my body, but also in my response, then I haven't really listened because I haven't had the opportunity to check or get feedback from you. So we also have to signal that we heard you. So I can listen, but then I might paraphrase, or I might ask a question that demonstrates complete understanding, or I might share a story that parallels yours to demonstrate I understood your key point. So whenever we listen, we also have to signal that we are learning, and that's critical for how we connect with people.
So what you mentioned is listen to the bottom line rather than listening to the top line, what is being said, listening at the surface level, go deeper, as deep as possible, and reflect back, paraphrase, question, share a story, and listen with an intent to learn something from the other person. When you spoke about listen to the bottom line, I can only listen to that line in the hierarchy of different lines where I am in my life, Matt. So how can I invite myself to go deeper in my own way of being so that I can listen to the deepest possible intent of the speaker?
So I think it comes down to three things. And in the book, I talk about these: pace, space, and grace. You have to slow things down. We move very quickly. So we have to take time to slow down so that we can really understand what's needed in the moment. Second, we have to give ourselves space. Sometimes it's physical space. Like I just have to get into a place where you and I can talk so I can hear you. But more importantly, it's mental space. I have to give myself permission to focus on you and not anything else in the moment. And then finally, grace. We have to give ourselves grace and permission to not only listen to what's said, but how it is said and the context in which it is said. And if you do all of those things together, you can actually listen very well, but it takes practice and you have to work on that.
Yeah, repetition, reflection, and feedback.
Right. That's exactly right. That's exactly right. And you can practice. I challenge all of your listeners to listen to your podcast, pause it at any point or wait till it's over, and then simply say to yourself, what was that about? What did I learn? What value do I have? And in practicing that, you actually gain the skills that you need to become a better listener.
Matt, as we are coming to the end of this conversation, here's the last question for you. What, according to you, I missed listening to that I could and ask another question that could have given a pearl of wisdom to my audience?
So this is very subtle and it's very selfish of me. I shared with you very early on when I was talking about my life experience as a kid that led me to what I do today. And I shared with you, I said very quickly in passing that the martial arts were something that was very important to me. And in that, I think there was a question you could have asked a little bit more, because for me personally, the study of the martial arts has been evolutionary. I have learned so much about myself and about life, about how to communicate, how to connect. And it's important, I think, that everybody finds some kind of physical practice. I don't care if it's walking in nature, playing cricket, playing a musical instrument. Everybody should, I believe, find some physical outlet that allows you to learn about yourself and connect with other people. And we can learn so much from that. We get so cerebral. And if we can find an activity that is not just in our heads, it can really expand and help us grow into what I think are better human beings. So if there was, I think you're a fantastic interviewer. I love how you pulled together different ideas. But if I had to pick one thing that I wish you would have explored a little bit more, that is it.
Yeah. Thank you for the feedback. And I would definitely reflect. And repetition is something that I do in the ways of feeling faster, feeling stronger, feeling again. Matt, thank you so much.
I wouldn't even call it failing. I would just say the way you're learning. You're learning faster.
Learning faster.
Failing and learning are the same thing in my mind.
Yeah. Matt, thank you so much. An absolute delight though it took us some time to get you on the podcast.
That's my fault, not
Not at all,
yours.
Nishan.
My life is
No,
a little crazy, but
there
thank
is
you.
there is time, there's right time for everything. As you use the word, the pace, space, and the grace, there has to be a pace. As you mentioned, there's the right space. And then, of course, unless there is grace, we cannot bring two energies together. So thank you so much for being a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful guest. So generous in your sharing. And I look forward to having you again on this podcast to share your wisdom, your experiences, your stories. I loved your stories. I
Oh,
so
thank you.
wished
Yours
we
were
could have
great
more
too.
time. Yeah. Take care, and I'll see you soon.
Thank you as well. I really enjoyed the conversation. I appreciate it.